Yeah, no, I was going to try to give an example with this pigeon of Kant, with the popular movements springing up. I think in this country, this sort of thinking is much more native than it ever was on the European continent. I don't say England, but on the European continent. The idea of necessary limited rule breaking as you go along in politics, I think is absolutely essential to political health. And conservatism in that respect, you may have noticed I have a fundamentally conservative idea of man. I think man is not as golden, as noble savage as Rousseau saw him, but he's vulnerable, he's prone to wrong decisions and so on. But the wisdom of the Anglo-Saxon political culture, which I respect in this respect very much, the wisdom of this Anglo-Saxon culture, which was originally also created by conservatives, let's face it, including this country, was that they recognized that this fallible man, the more he goes up and the more power he acquires, this fallible man needs more control. The more power, the more control. Whereas the continental conservative, including the French or the Spanish, believed that somehow God gives the people in power the necessary grace to direct the steps of the poor unwashed down there. I called in a very nasty little article against our Bavarian rulers. I called their system a God-forsaken God's grace system. You know, by the grace of God, you know, system. Because it's fundamentally not clerical anymore, it is secular, but there has remained this somehow dim, vague idea that as soon as you are a Secretary of State or a minister, you somehow have acquired, from way up there somewhere, the right to make those decisions, you see. And this, I think, would be the most essential point, also as far as your question is concerned. Be as wide open as possible for new categories of thinking and discuss them. And the fall down of the collapse of the real socialist world was all the more terrible because they claimed that their thinking was based A, on science, and B, on real popular support, that they were the only real democracy. Whereas the mistakes they made can be analyzed classically with this Turner example, absolutely classically, up to the point of ridiculousness. Maybe that helps. Yeah, and now you, the lady.
Yes, I just wondered, do you have any comments on the Biosphere project? Are you following them at all, and do you feel that because they've encased themselves in another world that they're going to be able to make any decisions other than decisions within that unit itself?
I think, am I right in thinking that you refer to this Margulis project, Universe 2?
Yes, yes.
Well, I met Lynn Margulis in '87. And she explained that project in Cornwall at a meeting of the Gaia, the first Gaia conference there. And I did not follow that example. But I must say I would be very surprised if that is successful. I would be very surprised. Because there are so many parameters you have to take into account for a living system that up to now, evolution, mercifully or unmercifully also, provided those parameters. And now to decide that on 4 square miles, I don't know how large the project is. It isn't 4 square miles, is it? No, it's smaller. That you really can assemble all the essentials for a sustainable universe for centuries to come. I think that's highly improbable. That's our problem altogether. It was the problem of Thoreau. After all, he sent his shirts in to be washed, you know. He sat there in the forest. Yeah. the answer. I cannot give a number.
Everybody else was doing.
What?
What he did was more constructive than what everybody else was doing.
I don't say that. I love Thoreau. I love Thoreau's writings. It's just that you have to watch out for the, you might say, for the holes in the system. You see, I mean, if he goes into the woods, he probably didn't intend to preach survival in that respect. That he said, I have to find ways and means to wash my own shirt or whatever without soap or God knows what. But anyway, it must be pointed out. And what I read about this universe too, there were also leaks. There were some, let's say, contraband. Some smuggling was going on between one universe and the other. And that, of course, makes it, I only say that about Thoreau because it makes it awfully difficult to conclude that you can shut up a system. You cannot even shut up the Kalahari. Bushmen, plastic pails come in and God knows what it is. Although my friend Teddy Goldsmith in '72 at the first Stockholm Environmental Conference proposed to put all Stone Age cultures remaining under absolute protection and isolation as a sort of a gene bank for humanity of tomorrow. I do not follow his reason there. No. Yes.
Would you pose evolution culturally, physically, as a counterforce entity, and what role would you say evolution would have in the future?
Let me admit very strongly that I'm not a natural scientist. I don't feel qualified to answer that in that respect. I base my work like any moralist writer does, that's how I see my point, on a juncture of moral endeavor, as you might say, and the information I try to glean all over the reachable information media. But this does not mean that I can make judgments, let's say, about the work of people like the real evolutionists, or people like Lynn Margulis, or people like James Lovelock. I cannot do that. But I try to gather the data they kindly offer me. So I don't know. I would say, as far as my work is concerned, I do not, I see, for me, resignation is not a basis for action, right? or for life. I would rather keep striving and continue the attempt, as I said, to move the juggernaut a few more inches towards sustainability. Then figure out arithmetically whether this is possible or not, and say, so what the heck? I mean, I might as well invest in Exxon or God knows or what, wherever the good money comes from. I mean, I just cannot do that. Yeah.
Going back to your study, I'm just curious, because the conclusion is so dismal, it leaves one with a sense of hopelessness. I can't go back. I wonder what the definition for destruction was that was used in that experiment.
Of destruction?
Of destruction.
Oh, yeah.
Would you repeat the question, please? Well, I was just pondering the conclusion of the study, the hopelessness of that experimental study that said that 12 intention individuals, with good intention, 11 resulted in, I guess, bad outcomes in the study. So I was just curious as to what the definition of bad outcome was.
In the case of Canaland, it was mostly mass starvation. In the case of Lohausen, it was a recession situation, more or less. I mean, when it was bad. But there were, as I said, there were more successes in the Lohausen experiment than in the other. But I emphasize again, I just had the honor to speak with a gentleman here who told me that, for instance, complicated decisions in medicine about very dangerous situations are now made in committee. And this is the most important thing, I think. This is the most important thing. Those poor boys and girls didn't have a chance because they were alone. They had to be dictators, you see. They could ask questions. And some of them who tried to be most scientific did the most damage. Because they asked, for instance, they wanted to find out why, despite added gifts of artificial fertilizer, the harvests went down. So they tried to, in order to isolate the factor that made the harvest go down, they would sentence the rest of the culture to an absolute standstill, because they wanted to have one parameter they could pluck out. And that just doesn't work because the system keeps living. You see, it goes on. And afterwards you can make red circles around those decisions and say, aha, that's where it happened. You know. But what is much more heart-rending is that those people then, for instance, hearing that their subjects start to die, you know, because they didn't have enough to eat. The rationalizations, fantastic, you know. They have to tighten their belts for their grandchildren and all that sort of stuff. And this is, I think, where it comes in. I think it's useless to neglect those findings. It's useless. We have to face them and then look for a way out. That's obvious. But that way is the tried and true way of the good old palaver. You have to find out what other opinions to that subject mean. And if they don't exist, I may conclude here this discussion with a true story about Erich Honecker. Maybe you know who he was. The last chief of General Secretary of the German Democratic Republic, the SED regime. A few days before the collapse of that state, they celebrated their 40th birthday. Gorbachev was coming from Moscow for the celebration. There was a detailed program of marching of a triumph march, an escorted car of Gorbachev from the airport to the place of the Republic, the center of East Berlin. And the program included all sorts of music groups, you know, youth groups with trumpets and all that sort of thing, and singing. And Honecker, in the days where all around him it was already visible, the whole thing was crumbling. He took this program and wrote on the margin what songs those kids should sing. And this corresponds exactly to a situation of subconscious desperation, which was very, very frequent in the Lohausen experiment. When those mayors felt there was no way out, they would deal with the color of the tiles in the public bath and stuff like that. You can really pinpoint that now. You can pinpoint that. And for me, that is a hope. I do not believe that we do not need science. We just need a different kind of science or other priorities in science. And I may here say that one of my most venerated teachers by book, although I don't understand him completely, was an American, Gregory Bateson, who unfortunately has left us. But I mean, the challenge is enormous, and I personally enjoyed the challenge. I must admit that, despite the fact that we tread dangerous ground. Yep.
Were all of the people in Turner's experiments in a similar age group? Were they all college students in a similar stage of development in their life experiment? And do you think that affected the results?
It could have affected them somewhat. I mentioned this in terms of conviction. They were not all leftists. That isn't true. Even at the time, the university spirit in Germany was rather leftist. They were by no means all leftist. And the bad decision makers as I mentioned, you couldn't pick out whether they were left or right or whether they were Catholics or Protestants. That was impossible. But formal education was certainly above average. But I mean,
What about life experience?
in the Drago experiment, which followed up the refined Tannerland experiment, groups were played against each other, and they were all groups of executives. And you should read those results. Above all, a terrible a problem of shifting the blame to the others in the group, you see. Yeah.
So you said the basis of your striving is the challenge or the adversity. Is that the sole basis? And how does your experience fit into all that?
I have a very dull, uneasy feeling that I don't have enough enemies. No, I tell you what I mean. The first person singular is all wrong. What I feel is our cause, our green cause, has too few enemies. There are too few people. There are many people in money-making sections of the public. Let's put it that way, who really think they can get away by just adapting our vocabulary, you know. There are fantastic little bulletins sent around for managers' seminars, you know, with all this screening and God knows what else. And New Age. And you probably have it more here than in Germany, but in Germany it's enough, you know. And the most encrusted politicians all of a sudden talk about Umwelt, you know, and environment. And our chancellor said, "Die Umwelt, das kriegen wir in den Griff." You know, the environment problem will handle. We get it done. We kriegen es in den Griff, you know. I think it's stated that way, it's impossible. But so the great danger is that people really do not realize that they run up against laws which are more inexorable than any degree of a dictator or any degree of a popular assembly. My favorite satire would be politicians arguing with Copernic, you know, with the man who stated that the Earth goes around the sun, and that they would say, Mr. or they would probably say Monsignore because he was on a chapter of a cathedral. Let's make a compromise. We give you all the other planets, but Earth. And then he probably would have to say, well, sorry, this is science. He said, oh, this is science, that's all right. You can go home. You know, and that is really the problem we face, I think. Whether a Green Party, a political party, has to look, this was a basic German question, has to look for this enmity on purpose. That's another question. I think we only have allies on time for a limited number of steps. Otherwise, it's impossible. Yeah.
Well, it seems like you're raising a political economy question here, and I'm wondering in terms of, right now there's an issue going on in the United States where some of the more established environmental, quote-unquote, groups are being accused of selling out for taking money from the corporations who are supposed to be the opposition. Yeah. And I'm wondering whether we should be suspicious, because the Greens at this point are kind of idealistic in the United States, and I'm wondering whether it's wise for us, whether it's wise for us to be suspicious of the motivations of people who have absolutely no reason to be our friends, but start talking like we're related.
Yeah. This is a point that is probably more urgent here than in Germany, but it's becoming interesting in Germany. I think that's, I'm very grateful. Just in the last few weeks before I came over here, I heard of many cases of sponsoring, all sorts of ecological causes. And people are already starting to complain that as soon as those people are in there, the sponsors' representatives on the boards, the topics become paler and more conciliatory and all that sort of thing. I mean, that one would have to really face. I mean, if people are interested in giving us one of our causes money, we would have to insist that the decision-making remains ours. I mean, if the cause is worthy, they should contribute, but they should not try to mess around with our aims. I mean, we really must try to make that clear. Yeah. Yes.
A couple of things. First, I heard the other day a Hebrew scholar said that in Aramaic the commandment is not thou shalt not kill, but thou shalt not murder. And that set me thinking for many days. I'm not sure if he's correct because I don't know Aramaic. It is not thou shalt not kill, it is thou shalt not murder.
Yeah.
And there was quite a difference.
Of course.
Yeah. And I just want to toss that out because you mentioned the commandment thou shalt not kill. But I do have something else that's on my mind. That in America today, my perception is that one of our big problems is a seemingly grotesque addiction to profit and consumption, both personal and corporate level. It's a very strange phenomenon that's happening. And people, what seems to me the way out of many of our predicaments and the general mess we're in ecologically and morally is compassion and love. But even among my friends and myself, I can see that that's often eclipsed by greed and desire for things that I don't need. Much less so with me, of course, than anybody else. But no, I wonder if you could address that, because I can feel both in myself and among people that I love this desire to help, to heal, and to merge, and it's constantly getting blocked. I don't know if it's Madison Avenue or if it's just a phenomenon. Can you talk about that a bit?
Well, I mean, don't worry, we have the same phenomenon, particularly in Munich, where I come from, you know, we have the Golden Miles too, you know, where we go shopping for the most inane stuff and costs as much money as possible. But I think fundamentally, to discuss it soberly, of course, one should also discuss it passionately, I'm convinced of it. But to discuss it soberly, it's a cultural question. It's a question of goods and bads. Does society offer a fan of goods, and on the other side of sanctions and bads, which makes sense for a sustainable future? And there the work begins. I think it's strategically, not just practically, wrong to talk always about giving up things. We have to give up this, we have to give up that. I think the more important thing is what satisfactions does a culture offer instead of the material satisfactions, the rather coarse material satisfaction that are hammered into us day by commercials and God knows what. I mean, take somewhat, how should I say, in Germany you say raffiniert, sophisticated cultures. In the old days, there are also traditions which could be evaluated. Venice, for instance, had all of a sudden an absolute craze of golden gondolas. When you look at the old painting, they were all gold, they were gilded. And that was such a craze that people ruined themselves that way. They ruthlessly overtaxed their financial means to have a golden gondola. And now they're all black. They had to be painted over black, the golden gondolas. The sophisticated republic decided it was going to ruin itself with that kind of display. The other thing is, which I find very interesting, is Japan. They had a very stern shogun once, I think it was a shogun, who also passed laws against luxury and made comprehensive lists of all the luxuries which should not be, should disappear. Clothing, everything. He left out one item, and that is a small cylindrical box on the belt of the nobleman, where he carried his personal seal, you know, stamped on the letters. And I read many years ago there was a special exhibit in New York of seal boxes from that time. They were the most incredible works of art, featuring 80 layers of lacquer or something. I don't know. So they cost an enormous sum, but at the same time they were materially almost uninteresting, at least in a normal solar energy economy.
What, did you ever see any of those?
I didn't see, I saw pictures of them.
Well, you should go see them.
Are they here?
Yeah.
Oh, that's nice. I don't know whether
Something that you haven't even seen. How can you talk about something you haven't even seen?
Well, I saw the pictures and the long descriptions. Are they different from what I said?
Yeah, they are. They're works of art.
Yeah, that's what I meant.
They didn't have hundreds of coats of lacquer in it. The
No.
art was not in the lacquer.
Yeah, but it's part of the technique was, from what I remember, was lacquer layers. Well, maybe they were not 80. Let me emphasize, I did not try to make fun of that. Quite to the
I
contrary.
don't think that was a luxury item. I mean, it's a little pouch. You call that a luxury item?
No, I mean it's a luxury item when it is very, very artistically made. Then it costs lots of money, possibly.
If I may take a stab at the gentleman's question there, which was the profit and the desire for profit is an issue which I'm particularly interested in. And what I find is that the techniques which we use for making decisions on what is profit in this society and the same techniques that are used over in Europe and Germany, i.e. the balance sheet, the income statement that accounting gives as the decision-making tool the businessman has, does not include the bags. They have an industrial process that produce a good, but the cost of the bag, which may be very hard to put a number on. Economically, we call it quantifying negative externalities, but it's hard to put a number on that bad because that bad is spread out between so many millions and millions of people sometimes. And it's so indeterminate that this is one of the aspects that has to be dealt with, is taking and finding ways of bringing into the decision-making process the true costs of these activities, which are not. To give you a local example, we have a nuclear power plant in San Onofre, and the balance sheet for Southern California Edison, the company which controls that refinery, does not include the proper shutdown costs, and therefore the income statements today are not having the expense of this shutdown cost, which then is subsidizing today's generation of electricity with tomorrow's debt that will have to be incurred. So that's one aspect. Now the psychological aspect which you brought up about the profit, desire for profit, the desire for ostentatious items, which you gave as an example, that's a different matter. And I will give you one example. The Romans, and many times during their wars, would have laws, particularly in wartime, forbidding luxury items. It's a very ancient tradition. But the idea of how you handle putting numbers on these things. If you want to put into a free enterprise system, how do you put numbers on these bags? It's very difficult. Economics is not even beginning to deal with this issue, except that they address it.
I fully concur. The one, I know a few studies in Switzerland, Binswanger and others, Billwanger, they do try to form what they call an ecologically sound GNP idea, you know, gross national product idea. Then there's the proposal which gains more and more following in Germany of an energy tax, shifting the tax burden over from human labor, where now most of the taxes come in, from taxes on labor, paid by the employee. The percentage of that tax mounts from year to year. It's very interesting. Whereas the income tax on high income and so on is lower, and more energy is actually, more energy use is actually subsidized up to now. So any industrialist who doesn't automize his plant is a fool. He has higher wage costs and low energy costs. I mean, that's one aspect. But please, I may repeat my plea from before. I'm not a learned economist. I have friends who deal with those things. We have a small society where we have representatives of both the life sciences and some economists. I think the tax system is really something which should be seriously considered. History shows that all regimes doomed in their time, from the Roman Empire to the Ancien regime of the French, had tax systems which in our eyes today are absurd. But to them, to the old forces who ruled at that time, they made absolute sense. Or they thought there wasn't any other way to get taxes. I mean, whatever it is. Today we have a very elegant way of taking taxes. Every workman pays them theoretically. He doesn't even see the money he pays to the state. It's on the slip. So I think we should seriously look into those things. And if a Green Party ever comes into responsibility, I think this is one of the first items they should look at. That could come a little close to what you mean. I mean, in terms of energy and pollution balance. The profit motive, I really, please, I think it is connected with what I said about satisfactions in a society. Let us not dwell on just on aesthetics, but also on other things. I think that a society which depends entirely on material profits is a very poor society, fundamentally. It is not a rich society, because it doesn't have other outlets for ambition. But this is all work which cannot be described by me from a dais. I refuse that all. I mean, I try to give impulses and hope that there are enough other people who will take up the work from there, and I'm very grateful for work from others. That should be our attitude. Thank you.